Phoenix.
So you were talking about Phoenix.
How it got its name.
How it got its name, and then
Phoenix, right?
yeah, and okay, so yeah.
Yeah. So we did, over the next 10-year period, 1980 to 1990, 32 issues, including 4 double issues, 2 or 3 on women, special theme issues. We always went for theme issues. Women's issues. We had 2 prisoner rights issues. We had at least 2 housing issues. One, I remember Pat Capone had in our first issue, she wrote something on the boarding houses here, the lousy boarding houses and the corrupt landlords here in Parkdale, or something like that, about how rough it was. There was a piece by her in the first issue. But we had, we talked about homelessness when it was not even on the city radars. It was just token conversation. We took it seriously because so many psychiatric survivors end up on the street, or if they weren't survivors when they're in the street, they certainly were driven mad or crazy by trying to survive on the street. So we talked about that. We laid out in the first issue what it means to be an inmate. We were one of the first to use, although certainly in Canada, to talk about and to conceptualize what a psychiatric inmate was. We used that term. We start, being locked up, not having any rights, and being treated like shit, while you're locked up. That's what we talked about, and losing your rights as a citizen. And we talked about psychiatric abuse. Carla wrote the first editorial. Plus, so she was very important in the founding of Phoenix and keeping it going, because I don't forget that for a while. We owe a big debt to her. And we had 3 issues. We had a section in every issue after a while on electroshock, on the movement. At that time, the movement underwent some names, just as the names for patients underwent changes as political consciousness changed. At first, we talked about, well, some people still use the word mental patient, but we quickly, what is the word, deconstructed it, and instead used, psychiatric survivor. But that went through, first it was the inmate, an ex-inmate, and then, but we never used the word consumer. We never accepted psychiatric consumer, except put quotes around that, because we know the term implies, choice and the services that you could shop around for. Well, excuse me, but that doesn't. There's no reality to that when you're caught up in the psychiatric system or the so-called mental health system. The word mental health was deconstructed too, because the ones in charge of psychiatry are the psychiatrists. It's a hierarchical, patriarchal, oppressive system. So why call it mental health? It's not mental health. It's a psychiatry-dominated system, psychiatric system. Anyway, so in the Phoenix was consciously and consistently opposed to and resistant to the psychiatric system, the mental health system. It consistently advocated. The magazine was an advocacy organ for people locked up or afraid of being locked up again. It was a networking tool. We started to form links at some point with the, not strong links, but we were trying before we closed shop in 1990 with the prison abolitionists
and links,
disability.
And what about links with other, across the country with other psych survivor, with the community? Because Phoenix was in national, international, you know, it's spread around. I guess I'm just wondering, what about the links between On Our Own and Phoenix Rising and other patient movements in Canada?
Okay, I have to tell you, and this is true, the board of directors for On Our Own were quite reactionary at some point. They couldn't understand why we were so critical of psychiatric drugs, a number of members of the board. Well,
so that was part of the split that you talked about.
that's one thing. We split because they criticized Phoenix, the board, for being so much against psychiatry. And we came back, or I came back and said, well, listen, this is an alternative way. I mean, there is plenty to be angry about and to oppose, like loss of your rights. Come on. The board of directors of On Our Own was, as they said, was quite reactionary and often right-wing. Our magazine was just the opposite. Phoenix was very much on the left, of course, always was. Talking about rights, talking about justice for us, talking about independence, criticizing psychiatric treatments, so-called treatments.
So what happened?
So we split. And then the final thing was they accused us, falsely, the board, of not paying rent. We paid $250, we had a very low rent, we had a couple rooms, Woodbine and Queen, which is where Phoenix, one of the locations of Phoenix was the original. And we had paid rent. And that really got us.
What year was
false
that?
accusation of not paying rent.
And what year was that, do you think?
89, 88.
Oh, okay, so
1988, a couple years before the magazine shut down.
So you started off with On Our Own, but at a certain
We
point...
were part of On Our Own.
Yeah, and at a certain point, then Phoenix and On Our Own split.
Right, we were the publishing arm of On Our Own,
Mm-hmm.
actually, the way I like to see it. In 1988, we split because we weren't going to accept being falsely accused. And we couldn't deal with this right-wing boards. You know, they were trying to rationalize what we considered serious abuses in the system. And we said, no, you're wrong. And we're not going to go along with, we're not going to prettify or rationalize abuse. And that's what the magazine was into exposing. We were doing our own investigative journalism, our own investigative reporting. We had some outstanding people working for us, free. Only 2 people got paid in 10 years from grants. And then the grants were only about half the time we were funded. And when we split I remember that special emergency board meeting called. So we said, okay, we're going to go on our own. That's it. On our own, we're going to split from you guys. And we did, and we set up, we moved our location, let's see, to Euclid and College. It was a theater upstairs, we were downstairs. Dan Heath, the NDP MP, the immigration critic for the federal MP at that time, nice neighbor, their office was right near us, in the basement of the theater of Euclid.
Yeah.
Euclid, and before then we were in Portland. From Woodbine and Queen to Portland. That was just at Queen near Bathurst, the block west of east of Bathurst, and then after a while, I guess we could. A few months, I don't know why we had to move again. I think it was probably a question of rent that we couldn't afford. And then we ended up finally at Euclid. Maggie Tallman helped keep the magazine going. She was amazing as our business manager, and she never got paid. She put in thousands of hours of work. People put in hundreds of hours of work, never got paid because we didn't have a grant, we didn't have the money. We solicited, we got grants from the Women's Directorate of the Ontario Ministry of Health. It was always tied, the money was tied to particular issues, right? The women's issue, of course, we really were successful with. We got, the second issue was women's issue. The health and welfare at that time, we got, the longest grant was for 2 years. That was almost permanent funding for us. But we never, but it was, well, we put out a lot of stuff against shock and, yeah, drugs. We had a special issue on legal, on the charter. Translating and deconstructing, well, sort of reinterpreting it for psychiatric survivors. We always had a section on the movement, which I call it on conferences on human rights and psychiatric repression. That was the name of the movement after it changed its name from Mental Patients Liberation. The word mental patients, it just sticks in my throat. That was dropped. Now, but yeah, we had a circulation, roughly about 3,000 readers, something like that. We always gave free copies of every issue to prisoners on request. Prisoners, including psychiatric for prisoners and regular prisoners. That was our policy. I haven't heard of a similar policy, but if you were locked up, you got the magazine free.
So where did you send the magazines?
So we established connection. We got good stories from prisoners too.
And what was your, across Canada and
the
United States?
Oh, they heard about Phoenix in Germany, in the UK. We had some subscriptions overseas. And
did you just fold because lack of money?
Burnout.
Burnout, yeah.
That was it, Megan. No, we couldn't pay people enough, and I know Maggie, I wish I had kept in touch with her. I think she moved out back to Alberta. She was from Alberta, has a family there. And she and others put in so many hours, and I said, well, we're trying to get money, but we couldn't because we were a very in-your-face radical magazine from the start. We knew it was going to be tough, but that didn't stop us because we believed this. 10 years, 32 issues. We didn't end up with a huge circulation. I'd say about 3,000, maybe more, I don't know. We had about 300 subscriptions, which is that experience. Oh, and at the same time, I met Dr. Bonnie Burstow, who's an outstanding feminist, who's one of the very few people I've ever heard of in academia that calls herself an anti-psychiatry activist like myself. She was part of the editorial collective, and she wrote some real brilliant stuff on homophobia in psychiatry. And we had a feature article. Our last issue was on gays and lesbians in the psychiatric system, which you know about. Double issue, and and her article on the history of homophobia in psychiatry, which she listed here, is quite interesting, and she helped a lot.
Did you have to be a psych survivor to write to be involved?
No. Well, we favored. It was mainly yes. We were into empowering our own people. If you were a prisoner, for example, with no psychiatric history, we had a couple of cartoonists I don't think he had a psychiatric history. You didn't have to, but I would say well over 95% of the contributors were, because we were out to empower people who'd been in the system or came out, and that would be against. But no, I mean, it wasn't. Yeah, I mean, that was, you generally had to be.
And what about, it was run by a collective?
Sorry, may I back?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not totally correct, because we had a legal issue, as I mentioned, the charter issue, where we asked lawyers to write pieces for us, so we knew most, virtually all the lawyers, 5 or 6 of them, were not survivors. Carla was, of course. She wrote a good piece on commitment, or on consent, the lack of consent to treatment. So, no, but I would say the vast majority of the people who contributed were, and that was part of our policy.
And it was run as a collective?
It was always run by a collective. The collective itself, yes, everybody was a psychiatric survivor.
And decisions were made on a democratic?
99% were, yeah. Sorry, it was always, yeah, by consensus. Or yeah, so Phoenix, and then a couple of years before it died, because of burnout, then Bonnie and I co-edited this book, Shrink Resistant, The Struggle Against Psychiatry, and the name came to me, and Bonnie said, that's brilliant, we're going to do it. So that's why for about 9 months we were trying to get an appropriate name for this book, and finally New Star Books, which you know about it, the publishing house out of, they publish radical books in BC. They're based in BC, so they agreed to publish it, and I'm sorry to say that it's out of print, but some people say you can maybe get it on Amazon. But that was the first book that was consciously anti-psychiatry and featured psychiatric survivors as authors.
Yeah.
The whole book. We had drawings, but those were done by people who've been in the systems. So the drawings. By the way, do you have a copy?
I do have a copy.
Good.
I've had it for a long time. Yeah.
So it was quite a publishing year, and that was the year 1988 when Carla McCabe's book with Harvey Savage came out, a critique of mental health law in Canada in 1988. That was published by Butterworth, you know, major legal a legal publishing house. So after that, it's, you know, during that time in the 80s, I was getting more and more involved in the movement. I would go to conferences, Boston, there was always a demo or rally against either big pharma, a multinational drug company, or a shock mill, where psychiatric hospital was always shock, which gave a lot of electroshock. In New York, I was involved in nonviolent civil disobedience. In New York, got arrested, but you know, the charges were dropped for all of us, or nothing serious, civil offense, not criminal, always peaceful, in the spirit of Martin Luther King, because we were heavily influenced by his nonviolent civil disobedience. You know, Gandhi, the nonviolent civil disobedience was, and still is, part of the movement that was with, of course, heavily influenced by the actions and writings of Gandhi and King.
So you were involved during that period in the States and in Canada?
Yeah, mostly in the States in the 80s. But then we started to get very active here. In 1983, Bonnie and a few others, Bonnie Burstow and Connie Neal, with Shaw and Carla. No, Carla wasn't a member, but we started the coalition, Ontario Coalition to Stop Electroshock.
Wow.
1983. That came out in 1983. So we're into shock. So the shock issues became very pivotal in the struggle against psychiatric domination, against the system. Because we saw so many of our brothers and sisters being permanently hurt, brain damaged, and they were afraid to speak out and needed encouragement to speak out. And we always thought it was an atrocity, a very serious human rights violation of people's rights. Most of the shock then, and to a great extent now, is given against people's will or without informed consent. Bob Ray, I remember Carla took the first case in 1983, first shock case of Mrs. T, it's written up in the law journals, where she refused shock in Hamilton Psychiatric, and her shrink, Dr. Diddy New, went around shopping, trying to get consent for her brother. Well, if she did consent, and he went to the family relatives, her husband and brother and father, and they all said no. And then the review board ordered against her will, took matters into their own hands. The review board, the government kangaroo type court in the psychiatric system, said, well, we're ordering 15 shock treatments. So Carla's husband, Mrs. T's husband, came to Carla and she took the case. She was practicing law while she was still active on her own. She had a law practice. She worked in a law firm, and I remember that before Justice Mabel Van Camp. And Carla's argument was that this is a form. It is as destructive. Electroshock is as destructive as psychosurgery, the cutting of the brain, because it destroys brain tissue. It was a very convincing argument. She lost because they did look at the other side. These shrinks at the Clark Institute were saying it's helped people and this is an ethical treatment and it doesn't, it's safe and all that bullshit. Lies they told in court, which were accepted as the truth, except that then we got Dr. Peter Bregan, the one outstanding psychiatrist to this day, who was called for a ban on shock at that time. He was still representing, he was always critical of it in his books, in a number of books. And Carla called him as an expert witness. And we had a bio-neurologist, a neuroscientist from U of T, forgot his name, but he testified against this, that it causes, they gave affidavits. We lost, but Mrs. T didn't get shocked. Instead, what they did in end around, well, not an end around, what they did was the doctors transferred her to another doctor or referred her to a doctor who wouldn't give shock in another hospital. So she never was shocked. That was the first time of intervention. And we were packing the court, all the coalition members. At that time, we had maybe 15 members, maximum 20 members, mostly shock survivors, human rights advocates, disability people involved in the disability movement, as part of the coalition, the Ontario Coalition to Stop Electroshock. We started, that came out of a town hall type of meeting, a public meeting at City Hall, Council Chamber, which was videotaped by Rogers, I should add, I have it. 90 minutes. David Revel was chairing, Carla was on it, Connie Neal, who had shock. Revel, as you know, was locked up. We had a historian shrink with resistance at Kingston Psychiatric. He hadn't had shock, but all the others on the panel did. Shirley Johnson, Serafino, Fred Serafino, they're out on the West Coast now, I think. Carla, acute tapping was very active. He had shock at Hamilton, so that was the first public forum on electroshock in Canada in August of 1993. My memory is not too bad for certain.
No, it's much better than mine.
But for others, if you tell me what I had for lunch, ask what I had for lunch yesterday or the day before, I can't tell. Anyway, so that was going on, and the case, and Bob Ray gets up in the legislature because of our exposing the fact that people are getting shot, often against their will. He said, I didn't know that people, this is not right that people should be getting shocked against their will. He stood up, it's in the Hansard. He was the first, I'll give him credit, he was the first, even though I didn't like some of his policies, Ray got up and was critical as a premier. That was new. That made headlines. That made a news story. So we were encouraged. That was about after the court case, the Mrs. T case in the Supreme Court, in the Ontario Supreme Court. And about that time in January of '84, okay, we were really gearing up. We had held we held the first demonstration against shock in front of the Clark Institute, which still is a shock now, but they give a lot more shock than any other institution in Ontario, at least. And we had about, I don't know, 50 or so people showing up for the first demo. We got some press out of it. Not now. The press couldn't care less now when we demonstrate, but at that time they did. And then we went, he said, look, we've got to bring this to, then we thought we've got to try to get the city to do something against shock.
The city?
Well, we wanted to the Board of Health.
Oh, okay.
See, well, this is a health issue, right? This is a human rights issue. So we went to a public meeting of the Board of Health. We had 7 of our speakers. They had big shots in the Clark arguing against us. The Board of, we said this, the city should, we were calling for a moratorium. We wanted a ban. But Revel, I must say, he re-edited didn't fairly present our stuff. He was on the Board of Health at that time. He was an alderman at that time. Now we call him councillors. He was called an alderman. So I must say, he was and he wasn't. The board passed a resolution saying, yes, there should be a moratorium, a temporary stoppage of shock in Ontario with more study. The first Board of Health, the first city agency, the first city department, the Board of Health, the only Board of Health that's ever come out against, but it didn't have any legal weight because the province, every province, the final authority over all medical treatment. Mm-hmm. They said, no, we're not going to enforce it. Threw it in the wastebasket. Threw it in the wastebasket. Or they didn't act on it. But it was significant. A Board of Health. We convinced. They bought our argument, the Board of Health, and dismissed the argument from the shrink and the Clark social workers who were arguing for, oh, this is the greatest thing since Swiss cheese, So that was a victory. So we started on a roll. And so what happened? As a result of that Board of Health meeting, the Ontario, Keith Norton, I think he was the Minister of Health, he was health minister, said, well, we should call a committee and look into this. So they struck a committee of 16 people, mainly politicians and psychiatrists. Said, wait a minute now. It was called the Review Committee or something. This ECT Review, the Review Committee for the Study of Electroshock or something. No shock survivors were on the committee, 16. 3 or 4 shrinks were on, psychiatrists, who all favored it. They had some academics on too. No shock survivors. I said, they're talking about us and not having a shock survivor. So we lobbied and we resorted to civil disobedience when we called, we petitioned the health minister, appoint, it was all appointments, appoint Carla McKay. She's a shock survivor and a lawyer. Didn't hear anything for months. So, okay. So we decided to resort to civil disobedience. So we had a sit-in in the minister's office and refused to leave for the whole day.
What year was that?
1984. July 1984. July 3rd, I think. Our first nonviolent civil disobedient action of the coalition. There were three of us. Shirley Johnson, Bonnie Burstow, and myself. And we said, may we see the minister? So we went in the front door and said, we'd like to speak with the minister. No, he's not available. Of course, we knew he was there, so that he could have been called. They said, well, we'll wait. So we sat down and refused to for the next 6 hours, 6 to 7 hours. And the guard came and ushered us out, forced us out. But we got pressed. Adam Vaughn, what's Adam Vaughn's father's name? Cullen Vaughn from the City TV was there, the only reporter who was interested. He was there. He was quite a supporter for us, and I miss him. So we were forced out, doing our nonviolent sit-in. Got a little, I think it made City TV then. And we came back the next day for the same thing. But we couldn't get to first base. The minister refused to see us. 2 months a little later, he appointed Carla. So we had an effect. They didn't want to admit our effect. So since that time, for the next 10 years, that was 84. For the next, what am I talking about? For the next 15 years, we've had anti-shock protests and rallies off and on. And it's an uphill struggle. But one of the major reasons why it's so important to continue the struggle against shock is mainly to try to help save some people from getting brain damage, because it always causes brain damage. It's not if. I mean, we're talking 200 to 400 volts of electricity going through your head for a half second to 4 or 5 seconds. Now, come on. One doesn't need to be an engineer, electrical engineer. An electrical engineer we had on our side, incidentally, for a while. We showed up at the first forum at City Hall. And he said, you don't need to be an engineer to know that amount of electricity dumped in the brain always causes damage. You don't, 120 volts is coming out of your socket, and you're not supposed to stick your finger in an electrical outlet with 120. Well, we're not talking 120 volts. The average nowadays, and for many years now, has been at least 200. And the shock machines, by the way, have never been inspected or tested by Health Canada as safe and medically effective. So we got a running complaint with Health Canada.
Don, so your activism, the way I'm understanding it, is on our own, Phoenix Rising, and then the shock
and
protests.
The current groups now.
And the current groups.
Coalition Against Psychiatric. So
I'm just, because I think at a certain point, even though your energy seems pretty awesome, considering your birthday, I want to ask you, of all the activism that you've done, which is an amazing life history, what are you most proud of?
Well, I'm proud that we're continuing to speak out and continue to be active against electroshock and psychiatric oppression. The loss of rights, the violation of rights, and the advocacy for human rights for psychiatry. I'm very proud of that. It's a continuing struggle. I can't pinpoint there's one highlight that that epitomizes my struggles, but it's always with other people. It's not Don Weitz. It's me being a part of a movement. Actually, I consider myself a soldier, you know, in a way, in a good way, without using the arms. I've had a very strong sense of injustice that dates back when I was a young child, and I think that was rekindled when I lost some of my rights, and when I was disempowered, devalued as a human being in the system. And so that has fueled my activism, but I must...
yeah, and just, if you could say just something more about the movement.
Okay.
You know, because I think, so what does what's the importance of the movement? Like you've laid out political, like a very strong political agenda, but what does the movement offer, I think, in terms of community, or has it offered historically and socially?
Oh yeah, it sort of ebbs and flows about the solidarity. There is that. There is, since the movement started in 1972, and I got active in 74, 2 years after I dropped out of Green Street and stopped calling myself a psychologist. The sense of solidarity, the sense of real empowerment, not just, sense of people starting to get control over their lives and being able to stop being afraid of being treated against their will or locked up. That's always, I think that's united a lot of people in different countries. David Oakes, who's the director now for some years now of Mind Freedom International, that's the broadest coalition, which you undoubtedly have heard about, of bringing together, of networking with many different groups, some middle road activists, but many human rights, very active human rights activists who are also psychiatric survivors, and some academics. I think that there are moderates in the movement. I'm not one. I've never. They have a right to their beliefs and their views of what should be done, but I believe that very strongly in direct action, including nonviolent civil disobedience, as a tactic in the movement because the strategy is to get control over what happens to us. And this is taken away repeatedly every day in every city, in every town where psychiatry is legitimized. And this just drives me, I won't say mad, but mad in an angry sense, when I see the tragedies and harm that people suffer needlessly because they're not organized. So for me, the high point is, and especially in the last few years when Bonnie and I started the Coalition Against Psychiatric Assault, CAPA, which was inspired by other things happening in the movement. So there's certainly history of this dating back to the 70s, being more, as a coalition, we are networking too. And we have a conference coming up this May, as you know, Psych Out, the conference to organize resistance against psychiatry. Now that there's been no conference with that focus yet, although at other conferences throughout the years, we always have had workshops on forms of resistance. But that's also what's on the same agenda in the past has been, you know, narratives, personal stories like I'm trying to tell you now, exposés of psychosurgery, military psychiatry, I remember legal challenges, legal cases initiated by survivors and implications, workshops on drugs, just trying to get it. Workshops on drugs. So the workshops that are survivor-led, the rallies that are survivor-led, the protests against big pharma, this is all part of the movement, but primarily this is led by survivors. Now, it wasn't always the case, because in the early part of the movement, professionals were allowed in and were allowed to speak. And there was a crisis during one conference held in San Francisco in the 80s where some mental health professionals and survivors got into, well, I believe it was quite an argument, crisis. And what happened was that the professionals met in one room and the survivors met in another room during that conference. And from that time onward, I guess the conferences have been very consciously I mean, for the next few years, he said, look, we're just going to have psychiatric survivors here. I think we don't need interference and being patronized, because that was a criticism, being patronized by health professionals who still bought into the medical model. So, but now with the Coalition Against Psychiatric Assault, yeah, we have a set of principles, including being opposed to the mental, but we're also open enough to accept people in academia who are not psychiatric survivors, but they have to agree with the principles, and that's on the web.
And when did CAPA start?
So CAPA started in 2003, 4, yeah. It's been 6 years.
And I'm forgetting that you were also involved in PSAT and founding PSAT.
Yeah, with Mel and Jeff, Mel Starkman and Jeffrey Rayl. So the three of us, I think it was their idea, it wasn't my idea. Well, we were talking about it, but I think it was mainly Mel and Jeff that took the initiative. Oh yeah, so I owe a lot to them. I mean, we're still trying to, well, we have our space problems, but I won't get in. But yes, but it's the first archive of psychiatric survivors, which we're pleased about in Canada. And we've had some help about it, people making donations about every other week or so. Not of money necessarily, though we do get money from time to time. And by the way, we need it. If anybody's got some spare change, but that's on the web. PSAT. So, no, psychiatricsurvivors.com.
So, is there anything else that you want to talk about that we haven't covered?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm very hopeful about is that this conference coming up will have a more unified effect on the movement. That will really start to, because there are differences, of course. In any movement, you will get it.
Mm-hmm.
If we can agree on some strategies, which is very key for the upcoming movement, And I'm very hoping that we can go into high gear, so to speak, on electroshock, because we haven't had coordination. I've been speaking out for much more coordination among different groups in different cities or different countries. We know there are pockets of protest against electroshock, because that's like a paradigm of the worst, one of the most coercive, although psychiatrists would deny it, but one of the most harmful things. Not to mention the drugs, of course, are always harmful. The psychiatric drugs are much more frequently given, prescribed than electroshock. But for the damage that electroshock has caused and the lies being told about it by the psychiatrists inherited by mainstream media, including the Star and the Globe and the CBC, which plays into the psychiatric line, I'm hoping that we'll get more unity out of this. And this is something that I'm very concerned about, that we agree on strategies and we get more, that we get tighter as a legitimate social, and recognized as a legitimate social justice force, and not just as a fringe or marginalized group. We're not fringe, but you see, the media treats us like that. The media has enormous influence on the public, I don't have to tell you, on stigmatizing. And incidentally, every damn psychiatric label is a stigmatizing term. A lot of people haven't understood that. Being called bipolar, schizophrenic, it's not like being called diabetic from the start. This is the myth. This is the stigma that psychiatry doesn't want to take responsibility for, that the media promotes. That's how people get their information on, quote, my mental health. It's what they read in the Star, they see on the CBC. And what I'm saying is I'm pointing the finger deliberately at the media for being embedded with organized psychiatry, particularly with biological psychiatry. They are not independent. I haven't met in the mainstream. I'm not talking about the alternative media, like college campus radio stations, which have some really intelligent conversations about, or intelligent analysis. But I'm talking about the mainstream media is a public relations agency, a public relations outlet for biological psychiatry, and it is a huge obstacle to overcome. And I'm hoping that may be addressed at the conference. And I hope you can manage to come.
Oh, I'm hoping.
Would you come? Because I know Bob Menzies is coming.
Oh, is he? Okay, because
I know he's coming.
I've forgotten to ask him that.
So that's basically all I want to say, Megan.
No, this has been great.
And to expose psychiatric lies, it just consumes me a lot. I mean,
I can see that.
That's why I write.
You've had a busy life.
Well,
I've got a specific question.
Yes, a question. Go ahead.
This is more of just a research question for me. You referred to a film about the NPA. What film was that?
Oh, that was made by National Film Board.
An NFB
in the
film.
70s.
Okay.
This was when Lanning was there, Lanning Beckman and Persky are in it, I think. This was made...
So it's not the CBC documentary?
No, it's called MPA. I know it's in the title. There are 2 MPA films by National Film Board.
2 MPA films?
The National Film Board, I know because I refer to them in my references.
In your piece
in my anti-psychiatry bibliography, which I'm compiling.
Okay, I can...
MPA, or Mental Patient Association, MPA Vancouver, or Mental Patient Association Vancouver,
okay.
Something like, inside the MPA.
Okay, because the BBC did a short 20-minute documentary on them, which must have been filmed sort of around the time that you were there, and has some footage out at the farm.
20 minutes? This one, I think.
No, this is, I'm talking a CBC thing, so I didn't know there was an...
Oh, the CBC, okay, that's another, but National Film Board.
Okay, That's
I think
just-
it's 40 minutes, something like that.
Okay.
But you might look into
No,
that.
no, we have to get that.
That was one of the first ones made on MPA in the 70s,
Yeah.
1970s.
Yeah, no, I watched the NFB one at the CBC one at the CBC Archives in Vancouver last summer. I just did I was doing some other research there.
So covering what year was, covering what years? Was this?
I can't remember, I'd have to check my notes. And
Current.
I'm gonna get a copy of it, but it's actually kind of cool because it was shot on 2 separate reels, right? It's like a reel, the old technology. So they had to put both reels up. Have you ever seen that, Willie?
Mm-hmm.
So the sound's on one footage and the film is on the other footage. And so when I get it, it'll be on 2 discs,
Cool.
and then I'll have to figure out how to. Anyways, I think that's great. Now, I am offering
I
people
go
some-
on and on.
I know, but you're great. But I think we have to.
Well, edit.
You have to stop. But can I give you some money for doing the interview today? Okay.
Well, if you do, I'd sooner that it not go to me.
Do you want me to?
If you insist, I'm not going to say no.
Can I
but
make a
you give
donation
it
to PISA?
to the conference.
I can give it to the conference.
I
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Yes, a very thing I want to emphasize about electroshock is that the vast majority of shock, like 70% of electroshock, is administered, prescribed to women, particularly elderly women, and roughly half of the women, at least who are administered electroshock in Canada and the United States, are women over 60. And this is, so that's why I call it not only a serious human rights violation, but it's a form of elder abuse and violence against women. And Bonnie Burstow has made the same point. That's why in the last 2 years, and for some time now, most of the rallies, the protests against electroshock in Canada, particularly in Toronto, Montreal, and Cork, Ireland, are held on Mother's Day to emphasize the fact that it's called Stop Shocking Our Mothers and Grandmothers is the theme. I wanted to mention that. 2 to 3 times more women than men are electroshocked, which psychiatry has not admitted so far, that they're targeting women, and that includes women labeled with postpartum depression, just a natural occurrence of hormonal changes we know after childbirth. They're targeting women with postpartum depression and elderly women. So we have, I look forward to getting, I hope, women's groups get active in speaking out. And that's all I wanted to say.
Don, is that historical, or is that also historical?
For many years, it's been like that.
So it's been elderly women for many years?
Mainly elderly women because they're the most vulnerable. What psychiatry does throughout history is attack the most vulnerable among us. And some of the most vulnerable, and that includes children now. Not children being shocked, but certainly being experimented on with high-risk drugs, and antidepressants. Part of the vulnerable, women after childbirth, there's a huge, and you probably know more about this being a woman than I do, is a big hormonal change. And that affects your emotions. You get very depressed, called the blues or whatever. And for that, psychiatry has psychiatrized it as an illness. And then, well, you're so depressed, I have just the thing for you, dear, and then a shock treatment. But elderly women who are often in a state of relative fragility, or their health is not as good, of course, and I know this because I'm getting older and older, but they go after elderly women. And to me that is, it's just so biased and unethical. And I have statistics from the Ministry of Health of Ontario and California, and I hope to get statistics from other places, including BC, that clearly show the skewed prescription of shock, administration of shock to women, and it's close to 70% of shock is given to women. So I'm hoping more women's groups that have been relatively silent about now, plus the nurses, will have to know more about shock than the doctors. I mean, because they witness this, come and speak out and break the silence. We need women, particularly, and more women, and some have already spoken out as individuals, but we need women's organizations and nursing organizations to speak up. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Because that is very critical.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good. And listen, the
So,
only
I know
reason
it
I
took a
will
lot
not
of
be at the
time.